All right, welcome to Environmental Studies 505 and to our MENV program. This video and the next video will talk about foundational principles of sustainability. Just a range of different things to get everybody on the same level starting out this course. Now, all of these concerns are relative and all of these issues are relative to our understanding of environmental studies. In this particular one, we're going to focus on environmental problem solving, the differences between conservation, preservation, and sustainability. We're going to look at sustainability and the concept of the maximum sustainable yield, and then just to kind of round it out, we'll look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals and an equation called IPAT. Now, environmental studies is an interdisciplinary field. There are contributions from the natural sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities. And so maybe you've come from a natural sciences background with a biology or a chemistry major. Maybe you've come from a background in business and are interested more in sustainability or kind of a career switching. All of these cases are going to involve a multidisciplinary approach. We need the foundations of science to truly understand what's going on in the environmental field, but there are policy implications, there are ethical considerations, and so really we're going to take an interdisciplinary approach to any of these issues. But starting with the sciences, you're familiar with the scientific method. The steps are to first make an observation that then leads you to a question. You form a hypothesis, which is kind of an educated guess, and then you make a prediction based on that hypothesis. The experiment then tests that predictions, and then the results will then tell you the hypothesis was supported or it was not, and these results that are then reported are then new observations that lead to new hypotheses. So all in all, science aims to be objective and non-biased. We let the data inform whether the hypothesis is supported or not. You need to have replication. It's not enough to just do it once. You have to do it several times, and you have to have a control group. The strongest inferences can be made if you have one group that's been manipulated and one group that has not been. And if there's a difference between the two groups, logically, it's because of what you did as a part of your study, especially if you can repeat that study. It benefits from lab studies and field studies. We want to start off on the small scale, do a laboratory scale study, and then scale it up into a more realistic situation. Now, environmental sciences are more messy than some of the other sciences because you have the uncertainties that accompany field work. It may rain. There may be a massive storm when you do this. If you have 15 plots, some of the plots might be different in their initial composition of species, and that leads to this messiness, but that's what we see in nature anyways. Now, environmental problem solving is going to be different from environmental sciences. It relies on science, it relies on data, but ultimately it takes more of a problem solving approach. So you identify and diagnose what's the problem. You might set some goals and objectives. We want to improve this by 50%. We want to cut our phosphorus emissions. You might design and conduct a study to determine, is this approach going to be effective or not? You might propose some alternative solutions, and then you try them out and you implement it, you monitor, and then you reevaluate. Is this working? Did this bring us to the solution, or do we have to go back and try something different, try one of our other alternative solutions? Now, what about the feedbacks in this? We saw the clear feedbacks in the scientific method, but for environmental problem solving, the feedbacks are a little different. You might have a case where this didn't achieve everything you wanted it to achieve, so you might consider what are the alternative solutions. Or you might have to go back and adjust your objectives. Maybe you want to get something 100% cleaned up, but that's not feasible given our level of technology. But maybe it's enough to remove 50% of the toxicants, or to bury it then and then allow natural processes to wear it down. or keep it away from organisms. So you have to kind of continually evaluate and reevaluate, are we being effective in solving our problem? Now, next I want to look at kind of a historical look at some environmental issues. And I want to kind of highlight these two founding fathers, if you will, of some of the environmental aspects of the environmental movement, John Muir and Gifford Pinchot. And to do this, I want to highlight the terms preservation and conservation. Now, those sound really similar. We're both saving something, keeping it for future generations. But these two concepts of preservation and conservation are really fundamentally different in terms of their approach. And we'll see that as we go on here. So first, John Muir. He took more of a preservationist approach, where he felt an area should be set aside, untouched, unimpacted by human hands. Humans should be visitors to these places of wilderness, not residents in those places. And he was especially fond of an area called Hetch Hetchy Valley, which was adjacent to Yosemite National Park. And he would argue it was just as good as Yosemite, and in some aspects even better than that. And he advocated strongly that this area should be preserved as a natural area and not converted into a hydroelectric dam to hold water that then could be used for electricity and irrigation and flood control downstream. And as you can see from this quote from the Yosemite, he felt very strongly about this. He likened the damming of Hetch Hetchy Valley to basically converting people's cathedrals and churches into water tanks. So he really saw this as a sacred place that ought to be preserved. In contrast, Gifford Pinchot took more of a conservationist approach. He saw the use of natural resources as really important to our society. Without natural resources, life is impossible. There are a variety of different things that natural resources are used for in our society, and we really depend on these. And he saw that our prosperity was dependent on the natural resources that we use. A couple of other quotes for him. The first principle of conservation is development, the use of the natural resources now existing on this continent for the benefit of the people who live here now. Now, he wanted to use these resources wisely so that they would probably be available for future generations, but he saw the greatest good to the greatest number of people for the longest time period, with an emphasis on the people living here now. These resources are here and they ought to be used. We ought to conserve them, but we don't need to preserve areas, because that would basically be putting them to waste if they could be put to some sort of higher use. Now, the question then is, who won this argument, if you will? John Muir's preservationist approach or Gifford Pinchot's conservationist approach? Clearly, while there are people that rightly advocate for the preservation of certain areas, and certainly we've benefited from the national park system, by and large, the environmental movement is largely focused on conservation, the wise use of natural resource, utilizing them in a sustainable way. For example, Gifford Pinchot was a forester. He was also the governor of Pennsylvania, but he saw himself as primarily a forester. He might look at an area and say, well, instead of clear-cutting the whole thing, and then it might take a long time to regenerate, maybe we cut strips. Every 10 years, you cut a strip, and then you allow that strip to regrow while you then cut the second strip. Seeds from the trees that are left will then get planted just through natural dispersal in plots 1 and 4 on this diagram, and then 10 years later or 20 years later you cut the second strip. Then 10 years later or 20 years later you cut the third strip. And so by the time you're done and ready to then harvest in rotation, then you have it where your first strip has regrown and is ready to harvest again. So this would be the sustainable use of forest resources. However, what else does a forest provide besides just growing trees? It's diverse habitat to a wide variety of organisms, and maybe some of them aren't going to function as well if you take the trees and then you cut the forest strips. You might replant them with fast-growing trees like pine trees in order to then harvest the lumber more quickly. This is then going to simplify the system from a diverse ecosystem down to a simplified monoculture that's more like growing crops. And so this is kind of a valid critique of conservation of the use and use of forestry in this way, where it's basically seen as something to be utilized, not something to be protected and preserved. So really, the environmental movement kind of is balancing these two concepts, conservation and wise use on one hand, and then on the other hand, preservation, keeping the natural functions intact. Now, I want to dig into the concept of fisheries just to give an example of what we mean by sustainability. So these are some fish. This photo is from where we were fishing off the Ocean View fishing pier in Norfolk, and these are the fish that we caught that night. All of these fish, croakers and spots and spadefish, are generally sustainably managed, and they can be harvested regularly, routinely. There are kind of minimal restrictions fishing-wise because people aren't over-harvesting them. But if something was over-harvested, you might put in a regulation in order to keep it where it would be sustainably harvested. And a sustainable harvest can then continue indefinitely at this level of extraction because fish then spawn, produce baby fish, they then grow up and replace the parents and then reproduce to then provide the next generation. So the population can continually replenish itself at a sustainable level of harvest. Now, I'm going to go through this diagram over the next few slides, and this is kind of a complicated diagram, so I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this. If you want to follow the link, then you can kind of explore this for yourself. Now, this is a stock recruitment curve, and it basically focuses on the maximum sustainable yield, which you see on the bottom curve in red, the dot at the peak of this, where you can extract the most fish possible and still allow them to replenish themselves. Now, this is kind of an ideal concept. I would argue you need to kind of slightly under harvest to ensure that they are able to replenish themselves. This graph basically shows the amount of fish biomass or the catch on the y-axis to the left, and then at the bottom the x-axis shows the amount of fishing pressure, the amount of fish that are extracted in a given year, for example. So at the top left, this is an area where people that see fish as not a resource but as a wild animal population, you might say we want to maximize our wild animal population. We want to have as many fish as possible. We want the fish biomass on the y-axis to be as high as we can and fishing pressure to be as low as possible. But you also might want to harvest from there, and as you harvest, then you increase the fishing pressure and then you decrease the fish biomass. So the way that works is along this line, this arrow that I've just shown. As you increase the fishing pressure on the x-axis, you move further to the right, and then that drops the amount of fish biomass down. Now, depending on how you do this, this might be sustainable or not. So fish populations, as I said, can grow and make up for low to medium levels of fish harvest. So for example, if we started with this high fish biomass near the carrying capacity and we dropped it down just a little bit, over time what can happen is the population, because it's at this point on the curve, low fishing pressure, relatively low amount of catch, it can then increase, such as the rising arrow, and over the rest of that year, the population will increase back to the maximum carrying capacity. Now, in contrast, what if you caught a lot more, kind of an intermediate level? That's shown here as kind of the middle level of fishing pressure. So it drops down following this orange arrow, and as you can see, the fish biomass drops back down. But what can potentially happen then is, because you're at the maximum sustainable yield, you've harvested the most that you can that year, and then the population increases back toward that carrying capacity. So theoretically, you can harvest as much and then just have the population replenish itself. Now, where we get into trouble is this. What about above that maximum level? In that case, you have incredibly high fishing pressure on the x-axis, and it drops the fish biomass down dramatically, such that there are not very many breeding individuals in the population. So those that are still breeding individuals can reproduce and can add to the population, but it's only a little bit because you're way above the maximum sustainable yield, and you've actually dropped down the number of the amount of catch that you have in each year. And then the amount of recruitment that occurs, it's only going to increase a little bit, not very much, and certainly not back to the unfished level of biomass. So in this model, the sustainable harvest is that low to medium catch rate, either at the maximum sustainable yield or maybe slightly below the maximum sustainable yield. Now, the next concept I want to look at is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. These were developed by the United Nations. They're a series of 17 goals, and they are designed to basically make the world a better place. In order to help the ecosystems of the world, such as you see here in 14 or 15, life below water and life on land, addressing climate action in 13, but also addressing people's needs. No hunger, no poverty, good health and well-being, developing sustainable cities and communities, number 11. And so this is kind of a more interdisciplinary approach, but it also kind of factors humans into the equation, that we are part of this and we ought to be maintaining good livable cities, not just converting all the ecosystems of the world to human habitation, leaving some area, protecting life below water and life on land, but also considering human health, not elevating preservation above the needs of people. And so these are different ways. All of these are kind of interdisciplinary goals. If you take any three of them, I'm confident that you can relate each of these to each other in many different ways. These kind of reinforce a concept called the triple bottom line, not just considering the protection of the planet, but people, prosperity, and the planet. We want people to survive, have a prosperous life, but not at the expense of the planet. And so initially, this was thought of in terms of different ways that we could be sustainable. If a company wanted to be sustainable, they want to make money, they want to be prosperous, but they also want to treat their people well, and they want to protect the planet as well. And so having this kind of diverse outlook on sustainability, I think, is important. Since then, it's really been expanded to the 5 Ps. People, prosperity, the planet, and then peace and partnerships are 2 that the UN has added. And so some of these goals, 16 and 17 from the Sustainable Development Goals, really specifically focus on this. If we don't have peace in an area, how can you then advocate for environmental conservation? People are going to take care of their own needs and their own survival needs if you're in wartime. And so many cases, like the Persian Gulf War, there was a lot of environmental damage that occurred because people were thinking of people first. And so, and the other is partnership, goal 17. This basically says we have to kind of work together for these goals. Not just one person can't do it all themselves, one organization can't, but you have to include willing citizens, non-governmental organizations or NGOs, nonprofit organizations, government organizations, for-profit businesses, etc. All of these need to work together to each achieve what they can and collectively achieve these sustainable development goals. And so those, as I indicated, are goals 16 and 17. Decent work and economic growth is a part of that. We want to have people treated well, but we don't want that economic growth coming from destroying ecosystems. We have to have clean water and sanitation to help ecosystems and also to help people. We want responsible patterns of consumption and production, which we'll look at in a later module. Affordable clean energy to promote better climate action. Now, kind of to wrap up what I'm talking about as some foundational concepts, I would argue that lots of environmental problems are interdisciplinary and they're interconnected to each other. So a textbook I used to use kind of boiled environmental impact down into three things: the population, resource use, and pollution, and specifically the amount that each person generates on average, the per capita resource abuse and pollution. And the authors of that textbook basically argued that you could boil everything down to these three things, because resource abuse includes desertification, local species under threat, climate change, things like that. And all of these are kind of interconnected with each other. And this works. But I think we kind of have to consider the role of technology, both for bad and for environmental good. And so some of your readings for this week basically look at this according to the IPAT equation. The environmental impact, or I, is equal to the population times the affluence, so that's the per capita resource abuse and pollution, times the technology. So you could have a large impact because you have a large population, or because you have a small population but a big level of affluence. Everybody wants to drive big cars that then guzzle a lot of gas and release a lot of CO2. Or you have technology that's then implemented to work towards solving environmental problems. Each of these things can impact the equation and ultimately impact the environmental impact. So as an example, comparing these three countries, the United States, Netherlands, and India, in terms of the per capita ecological footprint and the total ecological footprint of the whole country. So the per capita ecological footprint, this is hectares per person. So a hectare is like 2 American football fields next to each other, 100 meters by 100 meters. That's what a hectare is. So this basically says how much land would we need to meet all of our needs, to grow all the crops that we need, to produce all the fuel that we're going to utilize, to produce the wood that we're going to utilize, all the resources that we use, mining, etc. How many acres, or how many hectares in this case, does each person use? And so it shouldn't be surprising that in the United States, on average, large amount of resource use per person, 9.6 hectares to support the need of each person. So this includes cows grazing in Nebraska, farm fields in Iowa, plus the city streets that we live on, plus our houses. Okay. In other nations like the Netherlands, there's more reliance on bike paths and bicycles as a mode of transportation. So there's a smaller ecological footprint per person, and in India that's even smaller. Now the total ecological footprint then shows a slightly different story. The United States has a big ecological footprint, A, because we have a pretty big population, and B, because we have a really large ecological footprint in terms of hectares per person. So you multiply our population over 300 million people times the ecological footprint per person, and that you get about 3 billion hectares. India has a big effect because it has a high population. Over 1 billion people live in India. And so that's going to have a big impact, even if each individual has a small environmental impact. It's still 880 million hectares needed to support all the people of India. Netherlands has a relatively small population and a modest ecological footprint per person. So they're at 62 million hectares. So this kind of follows that IPAT equation. It doesn't really factor in technology as well, but you can think of technology being used both as a part of affluence, where it has a negative impact, or for environmental good. So this kind of wraps up this particular section with environmental problem solving, focusing on the differences between conservation, preservation, and sustainability. We used the maximum sustainable yield concept, looked at the sustainable development goals and the IPAT equations. From here, move on to chapter 2 for some more fundamental concepts. Thanks.